robust sense of what it means. What does it mean to go meta?
Well, there's really two broad categories that we can use to look at this term, going meta. So the first category is something that we do as modern humans easily in conversation without knowing it. Anyone who's written a term paper at the college level has made this move many times. And that is this ability to exit the context, the initial originary context. So, for example, if you come up to me just in a casual conversation and say, wow, something trivial about the weather. Oh, it's supposed to rain tonight. And instead of me just being in that context and say, oh, yeah, really? I say,
helps me. Bonita and I are going to be going into some deeply geeky territory, talking about 6 different ways that human beings can go meta. I found this conversation and this exploration to be really clarifying. Helps me make sense of the different ways that term can be used, the different kind of moves that human beings can make to go meta in relationship to the world. So this one is very packed. You may want to. This may not be one of those episodes that you want to listen to at double speed. If you can do that, then more power to you. But there's a lot packed in. There's a lot of information, a lot of insight packed into this conversation. And I'll also link to the presentation that this conversation is based on. You can find that in the show notes. And then another announcement, Danny J., who composed the outro music for Emerge, has just released his new single, which is that outro music. So if you have been enjoying the way that episodes of Emerge end, you can now listen to that outro song anytime you want. His new album, which he composed, wrote, created here at the Monastic Academy when he was a resident, will be released on July 12th, and you'll be able to find that at the same link at danieljw.com. And there'll be a link to that as well in the show notes. Okay, please enjoy this episode of Emerge with Bonita Roy. The Emerge podcast is proud to be sponsored by the Monastic Academy for the Preservation of Life on Earth. The Monastic Academy, located in Lowell, Vermont, is a training center dedicated to the amplification of human maturity in the age of the Anthropocene. The Academy trains its participants through a unique combination of rigorous contemplative training, project-based learning, and a disciplined commitment to ethical behavior, all held in the context of deep community. The Monastic Academy is currently accepting applications for the apprenticeship program. This program, lasting 2 or 3 months, includes silent retreats, daily meditation instruction, and regular authentic relating practices. This program is free. Other ways to participate include daily visits, week-long retreats, or, if you can work remotely, joining the Academy through the co-working program, allowing you to deepen your practice while keeping your job. For more information, you can go to www.monasticacademy.com. Welcome back to Emerge. Today on the show, I'm joined once again by who is one of my favorite people in the world, increasingly as a result of the inquiry of the show, Bonita Roy. And we're going to be exploring a presentation that Bonita has recently developed that she showed me when I was visiting her at her house a couple months ago. It's called The 6 ways of going meta. That's META, not METTA for you Buddhists out there. And I found this presentation just kind of electrifying and clarifying in that it was helping me to understand a lot of the territory that I've been exploring on the show, and could feel distinctions between the kind of characters that I was interviewing and the way that they were approaching some of the problems of the Anthropocene, but couldn't really like nail what made them distinct from each other. And so I found this presentation just, as I say, really clarifying. And then there's another piece of it, which is that I think seeing these 6 ways of going meta, as we'll explore, helps us reveal like which ways, which minds are we very used to, which ways have we kind of grown accustomed to, and what alternatives are there, right? What alternatives are there for us in terms of participating differently in the world, in terms of giving rise to new behaviors, new thoughts, new ways of being. And so I kind of wanted to open up this season of Emerge with the conversation around this, because I think it adds a tremendous amount of kind of like backwards context actually to the conversations I've been having, and I imagine forward context like to the conversations I will be having in terms of who's exploring which way of going meta, and furthermore why it's so useful to have access to these various, we might call them meta moves. So, Bonita, welcome back to the show, and thank you for taking the time to share this work with us.
Hi, very excited to talk about this. While you were speaking, I was thinking, wow, it's so fantastic to actually have an audience for this, and it just shows how many people are really examining their own paradigms, examining the way they're thinking about things and experimenting with that. So that's a big leap from even five years ago, I would say, certainly from 10 years ago. So just wanting to reflect on good work, Team Human.
Yeah, and so one of the things you say in the presentation, which I kind of, again, I think you gave specificity to a lot of intuitive senses that I have had. And one of the things you say is that the Anthropocene itself is a kind of driver for discovering new ways to go meta. And I think maybe that's what we're experiencing too, is that people are kind of realizing the deficiency of some of the old ways of being, the old minds, the normative mind that they're holding, and are looking for new ways to participate. And so before, though, we kind of dive into some of the nitty gritty, I would love to hear you reflect on, like, because I imagine different people have different context for what meta means. I think it's one of those words that people use and maybe don't actually have a really robust sense of what it means. What does it mean to go meta?
Well, there's really two
guess I'm going to
broad categories that we can use to look at this term going meta. So the first category is something that we do as modern humans easily in conversation without knowing it. Anyone who's written a term paper at the college level has made this move many times. And that is this ability to exit the context, the initial originary context. So, for example, if you come up to me just in a casual conversation and say, wow, something trivial about the weather. Oh, it's supposed to rain tonight. And instead of me just being in that context and say, oh, yeah, really? I say, oh, it's interesting. You ask about the rain. And all of a sudden I'm in this other context, right? And then I say, because weather is something that everyone, now I'm talking about this other kind of context about when and why and where people talk about the weather, and maybe that's a project I'm doing. So I've exited the actual invitation that you've given me, right? And we do this all the time, and it's kind of we're inhabiting a context, and the next thing you know, we're inhabiting a new context in which the previous context is contextualized at a larger kind of conversation or something. And so if someone says, what do you think of Elizabeth Warren's proposal for decreasing student debt. And then all of a sudden, instead of answering that question, I go, is Elizabeth Warren, her and Bernie Sanders and the Democrats and blah, blah, blah. So I've just taken that, instead of inhabiting that conversation, I've made it a piece of a larger context. So I've gone meta on it. And even everywhere in Facebook posts, you see this, you'll have an opening post, and then you'll see the commentary thread going meta in many different ways. So this is an easy way to understand the first category of going meta. And I think the audience knows we do that. So this is kind of an unconscious way, slipping context. So use all these different contextual levels. Slide. So but what my presentation is about is more of the second way, which is a little more sophisticated, and that is the ability to create an observational gap between the mind or the text or the context and your thinking process. Now, if you look closely, the first way of going meta actually requires a mind that can do this, because the unconscious slipping, there's some kind of a gap that is created between the initial content and where the mind has taken it. But I wouldn't call it an observational gap because it's unconscious. So going meta in the second way is being consciously of taking the initial context and looking at it, knowing that, let me push that off a little and then look at it, and then comment through my second level or second degree reflection on the context that I'm looking at. And we call that an observational gap. It's commonly called, from Robert Kegan, a subject-object move. So the subject, or the blending in the first instance, becomes moved out as an object for the new subject to talk about. In my work, I want to avoid the term subject-object move, because not every way of going meta makes an object of the other side. When you create the gap and then you're thinking about the other side, you can make an object of it, but you can discover the agentic and participatory nature of the other side. And so it's more of a subject-to-subject encounter.
And maybe I would love to hear you reflect a little bit about why it is that the Anthropocene is functioning as a driver to force us to discover new ways of going meta.
Yeah, so I don't want to say it in a trivial way. Some people say it like rah, the Anthropocene and all this destruction is an opportunity for us to evolve as human beings. I'm not sure that the trade-off is positive in so much that way. I think what it shows us is that very, very rarely do people, and perhaps never do humans as a species, actually change this drastically, actually evolve this radically without the participation of the world, without something pushing and driving them. We don't think ourselves into new and cool ways of being. This is true for rare people, artists and saints and geniuses. Observational gap because it's unconscious. So going meta in the second way is being consciously of taking the initial context and looking at it, knowing that, let me push that off a little, and then observational gap because it's unconscious. So going meta in the second way is being consciously of taking the initial context and looking at it, knowing that, let me push that off a little and then look at it, and then comment through my second level or second degree reflection on the context that I'm looking at. And we call that an observational gap. It's commonly called, from Robert Kegan, a subject-object move. So the subject or the blending in the first instance becomes moved out as an object for the new subject to talk about. In my work, I want to avoid the term subject-object move because not every way of going meta makes an object of the other side. When you create the gap and then you're thinking about the other side, you can make an object of it, but you can discover the agentic and participatory nature of the other side. And so it's more of a subject to subject and observational gap because it's unconscious. So going meta in the second way is being consciously of taking the initial context and looking at it, knowing that observational gap because it's unconscious. So going meta in the second way is being consciously of taking the initial context, observational gap because it's unconscious, initial context, and looking at it, knowing that, oh, let me push that off a little and then look at it, and then comment through my second level or second degree reflection on the context that I'm looking at. And we call that an observational gap. It's commonly called, from Robert Keegan, a subject-object move. So the subject or the blending in the first instance becomes moved out as an object for the new subject to talk about. In my work, I want to avoid the term subject-object move because not every way of going meta makes an object of the other side. When you create the gap and then you're thinking about the other side, you can make an object of it, but you can discover the agentic and participatory nature of the other side. And so it's more of a subject-to-subject encounter.
And maybe I would love to hear you reflect a little bit about
observational gap because it's unconscious. So going meta in the second way is being consciously of taking.
And maybe I would love to hear you reflect a little bit about why it is that the Anthropocene is functioning as a driver to force us to discover new ways of going meta.
Yeah, so I don't want to say it in a trivial way. Some people say it like rah-rah. Innocent creative geniuses, but in general, it's the movement of the world, the changing of the conditions. You know, humans have survived different ice ages and different catastrophes, and also different eras of flourishing. When we discovered oil and we had all this energy in a bottle, this was a event that created positive, quote unquote, trophic cascades, brought in the Industrial Revolution. So I think that you could call all of these techniques or technologies. Part of it is the human technique and technology. Part of it is the world itself. The world discloses itself as an affordance for what we would call positive, meaning happy and comforting and pleasureful change, and also as an affordance for change because things are getting discomfortable and dangerous and critical and threatening. So I think it's a sign of our participation in the world. And a lot of people define the Anthropocene as, you know, humans are the dominant species on the planet. But I think it's really, we're being forced to realize that we cannot dominate the planet, that we've never been separate, that what goes around is coming around. And so I would hope people start to think of the Anthropocene as the commitment of the world to do its part in worlding us. And it's very clear that the Earth and the climate and the biosphere move us to do things like change our mind, to migrate all over the world, to really embark on trying to solve things that matter to us. So just bringing the world back into it as a critical component of the Anthropocene. So maybe the Anthropocene is not a great term for this era.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so the first way of going meta that you mentioned, you refer to in your presentation as metasynthetic. And just for listeners, as a kind of reference point, it's really helpful for me at least to know of thinkers who are, famous for doing this kind of move. So two examples that you had in the presentation were folks like Hegel or Ken Wilber, who kind of took things that existed and then kind of looked at what was common among them and then created a new context in which they could make sense out of all of the objects that they were looking at. And so for Hegel, that's the thesis, antithesis, synthesis move. And for Wilber, that's famously the transcend and include move. But what you also say in the presentation is that there are certain deficiencies of the metasynthetic move that are kind of perhaps part and parcel of causing us to look to other ways of going meta to help us make sense of the complexity of the world or the kind of condition of the world. And so you mentioned runaway epistemologies, hyperobjects, and overmining. I don't know if you want to kind of paint a picture about the deficiencies of the metasynthetic before we kind of look at maybe some of the more novel meta moves that you've been looking at.
Yeah, so I think you hit on them all. If we look at Ken Wilber's theory, for example, and many, I think, of our listeners have some knowledge or familiarity with his aqua. Well, Ken Wilber said there's four basic contexts, right? There's the singular internal, the subjective context. There's the plural internal shared, the intersubjective context. There's the singular objective and the plural objective. And so these are four contexts or four native views that people can be at. And then, of course, he purportedly is then saying, I'm not going to be in any one of these contexts. I'm going to take a step back and say, well, here's these four contexts. What can I say about them? So he's creating a new context in which to talk about these four native contexts, and he's calling it integral theory. And he's applying theories of change on these contexts. It's kind of so. So what happens is it gets even more complex because now I'm in a view that has to simultaneously remind myself, simultaneously include all four contexts in every approach to every situation. So that's one part of the metasynthetic, is that it gets very complex really fast, it escalates complexity. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you see when in the early days of integral theory, I'm an associate editor of Integral Review, we'd get all these submissions, and instead of four contexts, you had these cubes and these hypercubes and these quadricubes and these fractals of cubes. Because people were doing the same move on Wilber's move, and we never published any of them because there's something quite neurotic and obsessive about the mind that does that. And so the metasynthetic escalates complexity. It also gives you a false sense because, let's say, even Wilber doing this move on these native perspectives, he fails then to ask himself, well, what perspective do I hold? There's the impression that he's holding the perspective from nowhere, or that he's aperspectival, and so his own perspective is untouchable in some sense, right? So this is kind of an illusion of the metasystemic move. But it's also the move that creates this infinite regress, because once you realize that the complex perspective that you're coming from can itself be contextualized, and you pop into yet another deeper perspective, and it kind of goes on forever. Right. So that's kind of like what I've watched happen over the last 10 years or so. But the other challenges for metasystemic move is, one, they exit their own domain. So there's this great book written by Sean Esborn Hargens called Integral Ecology. It contextualizes all the known ways that people address ecological problems, but it doesn't itself do ecology. So that's one of the challenges with going meta in a metasynthetic way. The second is this challenge that I talked about in my paper of overmining. you keep mining more and more complexity until you end up with a conceptual object such as climate change, which is a hyper object. It's so complex you can't actually manipulate it with reasoning faculty, and you end up in a kind of state of inertia. That's a problem. And then over time, this creates, it's just another term for it, runaway epistemology, that the way you talk about things gets more and more and more complex, but continues to get further and further from actionable impact. And yeah, so it kind of seems to be, I believe that we are at the point where many people are recognizing it for the kind of dead end or inadequate epistemic move.
Yeah, and it bears repeating that this is and has been the most common meta move in human history. That's accurate, right?
Yes, and I think that in small dosages, it's very powerful. There are many situations in which, let's say, we're doing government policy, and as we're doing policy with friends, we go, wait a second, we need more diversity. So I'm going to pop out, go meta, try to understand that from that perspective, then bring more diversity in, and then get back on to the work of doing the program. What do they say? Too much of a bad thing never creates a good thing, but too much of a good thing quite often results in a bad thing. And so the promise of meta, I have students that come out of, like, for example, in this case, the New School in New York City, and they come with minds that are capable of so much meta-systemic complexity, and that you can see as they're talking that from this view, it holds all these contexts, but then they're going to hold another context from that view, and on and on and on. And I have to disemploy them of their own skill and talent, really, in thinking this way, by really actually going meta on that kind of thinking. So if you can get people to do that, they can see, wow, what am I doing? I'm just creating this complex mental model of every feedback loop that I can think of, and there's actually no end to that epistemologically. What we may try to find the end is, where does the world end? But in terms of epistemological complexity, there's no end to that. And that's when maybe our epistemology actually exits the world itself.
Yeah, and so I think it bears saying that none of these meta moves are problematic in and of themselves, and really, I think the invitation that I received from the presentation is like, oh, there's like at least six different ways of kind of doing this meta thing. Maybe it's appropriate to learn how to be fluid between them and kind of leverage them when appropriate. And also to just acknowledge that there are other ways of being in the world other than the metasynthetic, which, it used to be quite comfortable for me as the kind of major way. But now I've been obviously at the monastery playing more with the second move that you talk about, which is the deconstructive meta move, which it didn't immediately make sense to me why this would also be a meta move. And so maybe I wonder if you could sort of explain how this fits into your view of the meta move, this deconstructive path.
So the deconstructive meta move is certainly associated with the Eastern path. In some postmodernism, like Derrida, Foucault, a bit, Derrida and Foucault, and that is that you take the existing way of looking at the system and you deconstruct it down to, in the Eastern path, to emptiness. You see that nothing stands on its own, or you remove all the linkages. And of course, when you remove all the linkages of a codependent arising system, such as thought, well, then it disappears. So it's a meta move because it requires creating an observational gap, right? So when you're doing meditation, early meditation is really to notice when thoughts arise before you can then manipulate them and deconstruct them, you have to have these objects, these relationships that constitute your internal experience. You have to be able to see them, to witness them, to observe them. And so all these meta moves in the second category, which the first two categories I talked about when we first started talking, require this observational gap, whether it's conscious or unconscious. And as I understand meditation, there's an attempt to do practices that makes it conscious. And then you can consciously start working downwards through the deconstructive path and removing these internal linkages between thoughts and affects and mental models and imagery and perception. You start removing these linkages in a somewhat systematic way to continuously unravel the complex knot of experience until you're left with subtler and subtler objects that also can be absented or ablated until you experience either their non-arising or somewhat conceptual insight about the nature of interdependent reality. So this is also called negative dialectics, in contrast to Hegel's dialectics. And there's, just to tidy this part up, there's actually different ways people in the Eastern traditions have dealt with this. I like to say that, for example, Nishida Kitaro, he worked with the dialectics more like matter and antimatter, that they kind of destroy each other, like it's a proposition and its opposite destroy each other. It's so cool. It's so cool because in the West, a proposition in its opposite or contrary create a higher perspective. And then Nagarjuna, he actually came to more of an insight on emptiness. And Dogen worked with these kind of deconstructive moves to create a whole illogics, which is quite hard to penetrate. But it's neat that there's like these different flavors of the deconstructive move in the East.
Right. And so it's easy then to contrast this deconstructive meta move with the metasynthetic in the sense that the metasynthetic is this kind of upward path of discovering novel contexts and broader contexts, bigger contexts that include the objects within them. Whereas the deconstructive path is kind of almost like the movement in the opposite direction, right? Where you're using the same kind of objects that the metasynthetic mind works with, but using them to kind of deconstruct to lower and lower levels of complexity. Is that a kind of accurate way of saying it? Yeah.
Yes. So in terms of Foucault and Derrida, they were doing that just with linguistics and language. But Buddhists all over the world realized that they were very close to doing what meditation also was doing on a experience. Meditation works with experience. Foucault and Derrida mostly with language and conventional paradigms. But that's that deconstructive move. You already start with something that's complex. You make it conscious by creating an observational gap, and instead of complexifying that object in your awareness more, you tease apart the pieces, which means actually to decouple all the relationships. And in the end, you end up with nothing, because thought and experience are holistically codependent arising processes. And when you take all the relationships out of holistically codependent arising processes, there's nothing left.
Yeah, and the deficiencies of this move are, as you mentioned, and we don't need to, I don't think, belabor this too long because it might be quite obvious to listeners, but are things like nihilism, inaction, and the very sophisticated term navel gazing, and so that's the deficiency of this move. That's why doing this deconstructive move isn't what is called for only
Yes.
at this time at this hour on the planet.
Yes, but why it is actually essential to a lot of the other moves we'll talk about, the more emergent ones, is that it is a direct path toward creating a clean palette. And when you're trying to experiment with other kinds of meta moves or metacognition, then having a clean palette that doesn't immediately go down the old grooves, basically toward metasynthetic or this infinite regress, is very helpful. So, yeah. So, there's a whole conversation we could have about this. We could go meta on the deconstructive move, but whether or not it is the end game, emptiness is the end game, or is it the fruition of a vehicle from which then a whole new mind can emerge? I've always believed it's the fruition of a series of vehicles or practices, which basically now you're at, now you're at the starting point. But there's a whole nother podcast on that.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things that has been something I've spent a lot of time reflecting on. It's that emptiness implies malleability, right? There's a kind of liberation of fluidity that emptiness offers us, right? If we deconstruct these other grooves, as you say. And so I guess maybe we should spend a little bit of time. You kind of went in a little bit to the metacognitive move, but I think it's worth just going down the list in order so we don't confuse people who might be watching the presentation later. Like how is the metacognitive move in relationship to the other two that we mentioned? Like what makes it unique?
Okay, so in the metacognitive move, this is the one that highlights this creating an observational gap. What's interesting when you look at that from an experiential, if you watch yourself making metacognitive moves or you study metacognitive epistemologies, there's something really fascinating that happens. So if I, for example, am thinking about the Earth as seen from space, and I'm asking a question about it, then in my mind, I have created an imaginary viewpoint, i.e. one that is not on the Earth, but of course I am on the Earth. And it's the same with the move from Ptolemy to Copernicus. To understand the Earth as revolving around the sun required Copernicus to make an imaginary viewpoint at which he could see the Earth revolving around the sun from a place that's not standing on the Earth. So what's interesting about metacognition or metacognitive moves is that as has been widely researched and reported, it creates this observational gap. But what has not been talked about very, very much is that in creating an observational gap, you're actually also required to create a virtual viewpoint in which you're standing. And then we can go meta on that and say, what are the kinds of virtual viewpoints do people create in different types of metacognitive reasoning or epistemologies? So, so this is quite complex. You can see how there's 2 or 3 levels there of inquiry.
Yeah. And so you in the presentation go into all the different modes of the metacognitive move, and there's a lot there. As you say, it's complicated, and I think for the purposes of this conversation, I want to get onto the 3 moves that have been kind of emerging now. And so I think it's useful to say at this point that these first 3 ways of going meta we've been talking about, the metasynthetic, the deconstructive, and the metacognitive, are fairly common in our culture, right? Like the metasynthetic is the most common, but the other 2 are not that uncommon.
Correct.
Whereas these last 3 through 6, or 4 through 6, are pretty experimental, and I would say are really a response to some of the limitations of the whole Western science project and a response to some of the critiques of postmodernism. And so it's very much like an emergent kind of experimental space that you and a lot of the guests on this show have been exploring. And so I'm really excited to explore these three ways of going meta. And I'll say the three of them, and then we'll kind of go into each of them in turn. So first we have the orthogonal move. That's the fourth way of going meta in your list. Then we have Simplexity, which is the fifth way of going meta. And then the last is something you call holistically oriented critical reflexivity. And that's the last way that you've identified. And what's interesting is that each of these ways of going meta, I've actually interviewed people who are kind of representations of this kind of move. And so, I'll make sure and reference to previous episodes for folks who want to explore any individual way in greater depth. But let's go through each of them. What is the orthogonal move?
Okay, the orthogonal move is kind of a move that says, let's just put the old mind aside and either move to entirely new what we would call metaphysical architectures or architectures of thinking, or move to things like that are very practical judgment, askesis, phronesis. These are all Greek terms because there was a similar moment in Greek philosophy which tried to say all this kind of conceptual thinking is not really practical. So we have actually a lot of these Greek terms. But what it means is, for example, in terms of switching to different cognitive architectures, Whitehead wrote a huge amount of work, a big canon, on speculative ontology, so that speculative metaphysics. He was saying, what if our minds in the world, what if we used our mind to look at the world in this different way? And instead of basing it on objects and things, basing it on movement and process. What if we make movement and process primary? And of course, everything reverses, right? Subjects become objects and past becomes future and effects become causes, because he reversed some fundamental feature of our paradigm. And so that's one that I'm really familiar with. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting to think of when in the history of philosophy that has been done before. Deleuze probably with rhizomatic interfaces and guittare. So I think Roy Bhaskaar's move to critical realism, and then the people that followed them that said object-oriented philosophy. Let's take objects as real and fundamental. What would happen then? So these are kind of experimental choices. People choose to construct their thinking and their paradigms this way, and to see what they can discover and what kind of questions they can ask that they haven't been able to ask in a different way. That's still very much an epistemology.
Yeah. And one of the things you say is that it's sort of like making a meta move on some of the primary metaphysical assumptions, in most cases of modernity, right?
Yes.
And so there's something really interesting in that too.
But what it enables you to do is, once you say, well, let's just turn to a different architecture of thought, then you just inhabit that thought. You don't make meta moves on it, because it opens enough novelty that you can stay at level one within the new paradigm, right? So that's the advantage of it, one of the advantages of it. So you revisit the same questions within this a completely different logical construction.
Yeah, and so one of the things you say about all the kind of movement between 1 and 6 of the various ways of going meta is that there's progressively less complexity in each of the various moves, typically speaking. And so, as you say, that in the orthogonal move, there's a kind of flattening out of things. So there's less ontological depth. But what I experienced the orthogonal move, especially like talking with people like Adam Roberts Or also, I think Rob Burbea is kind of exploring this in his own way in relationship to Buddhism, but that there's a kind of like liberation of creative energy and experimentation because you're no longer burdened by the complexity of the metasynthetic move. You're kind of like freed from that. And so there's this kind of like almost like aesthetic space, creative space that's opened up that opens up as a kind of flat terrain of exploration. It's really interesting.
It's a whole new sandbox. My favorite one is something that I love to live in, and that is Neoanimism, like Graham Harvey's Neoanimism, that there's agents on both sides of the participation. So coffee moves 1 million people every morning, and great wars have actually been fought over tea. And this notion of seeing the animated part of the interaction on what we would also call non-living or other living animals, that the whole world can become animated, that when this green of spring draws my eye, it's not just the desire in me, but there's something about the green itself that has the power to turn my attention. This way of this omnidirectionality of agents and agency is a choice. And when you make that choice, a lot gets solved, and a lot of novel experiences, the world can become enriched. But those are in the realm of epistemologies. But you mentioned Adam Robert, and it's cool because I created this term orthogonal, and then I realized Adam Robert was doing it. And of course, the title of his website and his work is The Side View, which means to make this orthogonal means moving sideways, And his is more on the second move, which is let's just keep our epistemology adequate to the practical task at hand, base the validity of an epistemology, qualify that as what works, stay close to the bone, use the body, use perception and attention. He talks about perception, the body as an instrument of perception. So kind of moving it down into this rich, lived kind of practice. And the second definition of the orthogonal move gets us really close to what we're going to talk about, the last one, which is basically not an epistemology at all.
Yeah. And I think what's really cool, I think, within the orthogonal kind of space is that there's I think you called it, I kind of hate and love this term, but metaphysics, right? Where there's this this capacity then to sort of like, oh yeah, I can see the world in this animistic way where everything has agency and is participating in me as I'm participating in it. And I can just kind of like try that metaphysics on, not necessarily because it has some sophisticated metasynthetic argument to support it, but just because maybe it practically delivers more meaningfulness or calls forth my participation in the world in a way that I appreciate, right? There's this kind of freedom to play with different ways of seeing different metaphysics even, in order to achieve particular pragmatic ends, perhaps.
Yeah, and I want to make the point that these moves require creative imagination just to like, well, then what am I going to move to? But they're not illogics. Like if you look at neoanimism, if I say coffee animates people, you'll see if you do a certain practice that it's not illogical, it's not fiction, it's not fantastical. You can see that the only reason why we don't say that is due to a construction of mind.
Yes.
Right? So we want to make sure that we're not creating just illogics. But what we're doing is we're saying, let's release the boundary of mind that always has it this way. And in this case, I don't create a different boundary. I don't say that then subjects, like, who is it? Either Dennett or I think Daniel Dennett talks about zombie people. So then he creates a different type of boundary, that people actually don't have minds. But here I'm just releasing the boundary of what it is to be a subjective agent in participation. So we're not talking about like something that is not rational or not logical. They have their own demand for logics within their own paradigms, experimental paradigms.
Yeah, cool. And so if you want to explore this meta move, I highly recommend Adam Roberts' work. And I did an interview with him previously. You can search for it with Adam Roberts. And as Bonita mentioned, The Side View is his publication, website, podcast. And he's doing really interesting work to explore, I think, this kind of orthogonal space.
Definitely.
And so, yeah, let's move on to the next move, which you call Simplexity. So what's Simplexity, Bonita?
So this area is actually being populated by a lot of activity right now. A lot of people, it's kind of evolved to some kind of radial expansion. Simplexity are modes that this is kinds of gets complicated. So there's this mode that seeks to identify something like source protocols or deep code inside the epistemic architecture. So, for example, I've done podcasts with you where instead of talking about power at this kind of like postmodern way where there's patriarchy and there's like institutional racism and all this complexity, we say, well, let's go back. What is power? Like, how do we understand power from a lived experience? Is an attempt to say, I've got lost in the discourse. Can we figure out what is the most fundamental, like I call conceptual prime about power, and then reboot what we're talking about? Because sometimes the discourse is really pointing just to history of the discourse itself, and not re-examining its own roots, and perhaps even our understanding of power is different. So this attempt to move down to a lower level of abstraction that's real in all cases, and then going slowly, not jumping into this hyper complex discourse, saying what is the problem we're trying to solve with this discourse, and can we stay closer to these simpler definitions to examine what our problem is and move toward resolution. And I did a whole series articles in Medium. It's put together as a big article, an integral leadership review on releasing complexity, which just goes through the different levels of systemic complexity that we can start to parse down to get to a level of what I call heuristics, which is just drawings that help us make sense of things. So that gives you but then a lot of people are doing it in different ways.
Yeah. And so I think what I found really fascinating was that 3 of the people that you identify as being sort of as experimenting within this emerging meta move are Jordan Greenhall, Daniel Schmachtenberger, and yourself. 3 of the people that in this podcast I've been most drawn to is having something kind of, they're holding something radically new and useful and relevant to the situation we find ourselves in. And so I wonder if you could kind of differentiate between what you see like Daniel doing and what you see Jordan doing and what you're doing.
Yeah, so I recently read a book called Ontopolitics by David Chandler. And he has a very good framework. I would like to share it because I think it gives clarity around this. And he calls the 3 different ways of simplexity as mapping, sensing, and hacking. So mapping, he clarifies all, and also he said these are all modes of thinking that are driven by the emergence of the Anthropocene, the effects of the Anthropocene. So mapping is looking for causal depth, and this maps more closely to what Daniel Schmachtenberger is doing. He's really interested in generator functions, highly leveraged tipping points and thresholds and trophic cascades. When you hear him speak and he's outlining how one thing impacts the other and impacts the other, he's really looking for ontological causes of complex systems and trying to map those out. And so in this sense, Chandler characterizes it as a focus on autopoietic systems. This affects that, which affects this, which affects that kind of thing. But the challenge here is that you can run into a situation where there's infinite amount of depth in the causal chain. So it is a move towards simplicity, but it has this topology of being very, very, very deep. Now, in the middle, Chandler talks about sensing, mapping, sensing, and then hacking. Sensing in this case is unfortunately not the same as what other people think of when they talk about sense making. In this case, Chandler talks mostly about datafication. And in this area, and I think I'm bringing it in here because it didn't make my tutorial, I don't think. And it's a whole range of ways that we as humans are moving toward that people like you and I do not highlight. So I think we should just put it here. And that is what he means by sensing is that there are, with the power of AI to look at patterns across vast amount of data, and all this surveillance equipment we have, and all this data mining we're doing from social media, AI can find patterns that are based on correlation only, not cause. So, for example, you might find that when women in London switch to a certain color in fashion, there's an uprising in Kabul. Now, AI might actually see this, but nobody thinks that there's a causal linkage between fashion color in London and violence in Kabul. But what may be the case is that some cell in Kabul sends their messages through a shipping company that picks up this color from some eclectic color manufacturer, and then that goes to London. So there are these contingent causal links that are, but it makes the final endpoint and the effect just correlational. And apparently AI is starting to notice these things. They tend to be temporary, and the whole reason for this type of surveillance is not really, unlike Schmattenberger's work or mine and Jordan Hall's, it's not really to create new things. It's to mitigate negative things. So they're really looking for homeostasis to keep the power structures as they are, to keep status as usual, situation as usual. But there's a huge amount of investment in this second level. And the reason why it's called, it makes my category a Simplexity, is because you're not looking for causal chain. You're not asking complex questions. You're just really looking for patterns across many, 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 many data points. So it's whereas Chandler says in the first case, you're looking for veracity or truth. In the second case, you're looking for quantity and velocity. Right? So I just wanted to put it here because it is a new kind of approach driven by the Anthropocene. Certainly, we tend to be less interested in that.
Yeah, and it is an attempt